Hi there, I'm Rajeshwari Ramani. Welcome to Asian Agribiz Podcast, bringing you interviews and updates from the animal protein community throughout Asia. In this episode, our regional correspondent Meliana is speaking with Rupert Claxton, Meat Director at Gira. He has worked as a consultant strategist in the food sector since joining Gira in 2003, with a high level of specialization in global meat markets focusing on developing countries. Here he gives us valuable wide-arching insight on how the meat market with all its business arms, including supply chain, are changing.
Good morning, Rupert. Thank you for joining this podcast.
Good morning. Really nice to have the opportunity to join you and to talk a little bit about what is going on in the world.
Great. Why don't we start this podcast with a short introduction of yourself and your company?
Yeah, I think that's helpful for you to know who we are. Gira has just celebrated its 50th year. We're a research and consultancy company based just outside of Geneva in Europe, but we operate with a network globally of consultants who help us follow what is going on across the livestock and meat value chain. So we don't work in other areas of industry, but really very specifically focused on this.
Thanks, Rupert. Rupert, higher shipping costs and longer delivery times have further fractured supply chains. Ports in Asia are congested amid logistic disruptions, container shortage, stringent checks, and COVID-19 infections. Given these situations, some producers have turned their focus to regional markets. So, what is your understanding of the potential within the regional market in Asia?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. We're seeing real interest within the Asian region, developing market potential. So no question that it's a good thing to be looking at that local market. The reality of global shipping is a global problem, and I know sometimes it's very difficult if you're close to the market. You think, well, this is a problem only I'm suffering from. But we know that global shippers everywhere, whether that's an exporter in Brazil or the US or Europe, are facing the same challenges of getting hold of reefer containers, getting hold of capacity to move dry goods. Everything is slow at the moment and everything is expensive. That said, the markets of Southeast Asia have been developing really well over the last 5 years. We've been expecting producers across Southeast Asia to look more closely at their local markets, and maybe some of those within the slightly wider sphere, so up as far as Japan, Korea, and of course the potential of China. So you've got good local opportunity, you can offer better service, and we know that the middle tiers of those markets, the middle income earners, are getting far stronger. So the potential to sell higher value goods and really make the most of what you're doing is there and developing. That said, we have a short-term issue today created by COVID in that the developing economies aren't able to offer the same consumer support that we've seen in maybe somewhere like Australia, the US, Europe. That means that we're going to see a little demand dip going through the next 12 months. And in some places like Vietnam at the moment, it's particularly pronounced with a lockdown. But as we look out beyond that 12-month period, then yes, that opportunity close to home gets even better. So a good time to try and figure out the opportunity in those markets within the region, for sure.
Producers aim for international markets in the past because of better premiums. How would regional markets compare now?
Look, it's another interesting question because there is no level playing field. We are shipping some parts of the chicken, pig, cattle from Europe, the US into the Asian markets because they offer a better price on certain cuts. So we have to kind of isolate the question and think about which bits of the animal we're talking moving and why we're doing that. So yes, the value of the Asian markets is coming up, even on the higher value cuts. And you can see that in the trade of beef coming in from especially Australia, but also the US across Asia. You can see that in some of the prices being paid now in modern retail outlets for meat. And we can also see that if you wanted to go back down the discussion into feed ingredients and the technology that we're using in the meat supply chain, then we know that the consolidation of the industry, the scaling up and the need to meet some of the international standards means that we're finding there's a market for all of those things at the same level as we see in Europe. So definitely an increase in value across the chain. I don't think it's as simple as saying this market is now the same value as Europe. It depends on the cut. So interestingly, we are seeing higher value markets for breast beginning to appear in the region. I think some of that's due to supply stress on the leg meat that's normally achieves the higher value. If we talk about the chicken, we can have the same discussion in the other species. So yes, they should look closer to home. And one of the things I stress when I'm talking to shippers around the world is it's not just about where the price is of these things. You've also got to sit back and think about what your profit margin is going to be on serving that market. So if you want to serve the European market, then you need to be inspected, you need to package to a certain level. You're restricted to only shipping into the frozen part of the market for the most part because of distance. Maybe you've got a better opportunity serving the market closer to home where they're not so specific on cutting, where maybe the packaging doesn't have to be at the same level, where you don't need the inspections that are required to reach the European market. So there are lots of different things in there, but it's ultimately for me, you've got to look at the profitability and the opportunity that you have in front of you.
Rupert, while the current crisis is ongoing or in the shorter term, do you agree that the regional market will take precedent over international markets?
Again, these are really good questions, but they're complicated. So it depends who you are. If I'm a poultry plant in Thailand with access to the European market and quota for Europe, they are going to continue to try and service that access that they've got because it's worth a lot of money in the long term. And ultimately, that's what that plant is geared for. If I'm a smaller shipper that's been doing a little bit in the further afield international market, then I might very well look at it and go, it's too complicated at the moment. I'm not shipping enough volume. I'm going to come back closer to home. And so there's definitely a stronger opportunity within Southeast Asia at the moment, despite COVID. Part of that is due to COVID. Part of it is due to ASF. Both of those things reflect on international shipping, the availability of reefer containers, the cost of and availability of boats, etc. So there's no simple answer in here. I think you've got to look at your business by business case and go, do I have a strong opportunity close to home that outweighs what I've invested in or what my company is positioned for? But there is definitely a good opportunity now. And part of that is created by the cost of going out to the international market today, given the difficulty of travel and so that's establishing the contact, and then the difficulty of moving containers and getting containers and the cost. And part of it is because the traditional big suppliers, Brazil, the US, Europe, are very much looking at the Chinese market at the moment and going, that's pulling a lot of volume. The prices, although they've come way down from where they were, are still good. And so they're pushing their volumes in that direction, and that's leaving a little bit of a void in Asia, Southeast Asia, that local companies can stand in and fill because the prices have lifted. So there are sort of several sides to this, and it's very much a business by business situation as to how you need to go about it. But now is a good time to build relationships within the region that might very well serve as a mid and long-term strategy for your business development.
So do you mean producers must understand what the opportunities and challenges of the target markets to then come up with the right export strategy?
Yeah, they must. I mean, and that's very much the issue is building an understanding of any market you want to go in and supply. And it's very easy to go, look, China's buying everything at the moment and they've been paying a good price. And we know that China wave has come off a bit at the moment. The expectation is it recovers. And to forget all your secondary markets. But you need to put product into a market to understand who your traders are that you're dealing with. How do they like the product? How do they like it cut? How do they like it delivered? What sort of payment terms? Who do you trust? What kind of pushback will you get? By understanding those things, then when the market becomes more difficult and the margin becomes tighter, you'll be able to offer the service that others don't. And then that gives you the edge to drive your business forward. So at the moment, when when international supply is tight and it's looking at other markets, and when getting products into Southeast Asia from further afield is difficult, you actually have an opportunity to do that homework and to learn what the opportunities are, because the buyers in those markets are also looking for other suppliers.
Okay, the next question. Which countries in Asia Pacific do you see leading regional trade in feed and livestock products? Why and how?
Yeah, okay. I mean, and again, it's all sort of swings back to where are the markets at the moment. So if we start at the bottom of the chain and we talk about feed products to start with, perhaps the easiest dynamic to pick up, we've seen huge consolidation and investment going into the Vietnamese feed industry over the last 10 years. But it's continuing to ramp up at the moment. So we're seeing the big international feed groups like ADM continuing to acquire facilities, expand their operations in Vietnam. And if you look at the capacity that they're establishing there, then it suggests that they've got more than they need for the Vietnamese market. So I suspect we're going to see Vietnam become an export operator within the region, in that they'll bring in feed ingredients, they'll process them into maybe concentrates, maybe feed additives, and then they'll push them out within Southeast Asia, because the infrastructure there for shipping on the water is established. They're well positioned, and we can see that the capacity already exists. That would be different if you went to somewhere like Indonesia or the Philippines, where the capacity is more fragmented, the infrastructure isn't so good, the double handling costs are complicated, and so I don't see them becoming big feed hubs in the region. So I think Vietnam could serve that role very nicely. If we move on into livestock and livestock products, then the conversation's more complicated, because not only do we have to look at where we've got modern production capacity, and so if we went back to Vietnam, we find that once we get onto farm and slaughtering, there's much less capacity for doing that modern supply chain. They're building some today. Some of that is dedicated to go to China. A lot of it is dedicated to replacing their ASF, African swine fever, gap in the market. And we'll see the same in the Philippines. Philippines has got a big hole in its domestic market in terms of meat production. That's caused by ASF in a market where we've seen rising demand, and okay, that's stalled a bit because of COVID, but it will come back. Increased disposable incomes mean that we'll need more meat within the Philippines market, and we're seeing already that there's a big import pull into that market. So they're not going to be a leader in regional exports. I think you can say the same in Indonesia. Infrastructure very much dedicated to the home market, lacks the real push to go out onto the export market. If we come back north, then Singapore is doing some interesting processing. They'll do processed meat products within the region, but they're going to need to bring the raw products in, and we see investment into meat alternatives there as well. Malaysia's got potential, and I think probably one of the undersold markets is good skilled labor availability in Malaysia. Production is improving in terms of its professionalization. The chicken sector is already very good. The region will always struggle for beef, so that's not going to be the issue. So Malaysia within chicken, I don't think it will rival Thailand, but it could become one of the push centers. If you come up into Thailand, clearly it's already an export leader. They've got concerns around what happens if they get a disease in country, but at the moment they're developing a pig export reputation, especially into somewhere like Hong Kong. They've got very good companies, very good brands. They are already consolidated. That is probably the model of where we're heading. And then if you head south, then really the issues, if we go to Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and India, is really about where we've got such strong internal demand, and we don't yet have the modern infrastructure on the ground, that they're going to be centres focused on their own consumption rather than an export. So for me, the export opportunity sits in maybe company by company, but Thailand leads. Malaysia's got some potential if they can put the pieces together.
Thanks, Rupert. What strategies can producers adopt to regain the market share they have lost?
Okay, I mean, the lost market share today is really, and if you take today as opposed to 2 years ago, and we've really got to go back 2 years to think of pre-COVID consumers. There's a huge amount of uncertainty sitting in the mind of the consumer today. We are far from out of COVID. We are waiting for vaccination programs to have been rolled out across the region. And all the time that the consumer is concerned about whether they have money tomorrow to pay for the basics in life, and meat isn't a basic, it is it's a luxury product. If we go across Africa, then it becomes very clear. Where we see consumers concerned about their disposable income, they eat less meat. So they downtrade from beef to chicken, and then chicken into starches, rice. They do away with the meat element, or eggs. So we've got to look for economic swing and understand where to put the focus. There's no point in bringing product to the market if the consumers aren't ready to buy it. So timing and understanding the COVID process is a big part of the strategy for regaining market share. And when you come back, consumers are going to be more interested in hygiene. They're going to be more interested in the production standards behind what you're offering, and much more aware of the things that cause COVID to spread, the proximity of people, packaging, handling. So we've got to look at all those aspects and start to build our companies and brands that the consumers trust. And the problem with trust is you put a lot of value into establishing trust with the consumer, in explaining all the things that you do very well. And then if you get it wrong, that trust is lost, and you're back to zero effectively, and you start again. So now is the time to start to work on identifying your brand and what you stand for with the consumer. But you've got to read the COVID situation. As the market improves and as COVID recedes, then we'll see buyers coming back to the market and looking for more product. And the key is going to be to give them offers to entice them back into meat, but also to reinvest in your image with them. I think that's the best way to understand that, and to make it really clear that you are taking the issues that they've had seriously, and to connect. I mean, that's most pronounced in Southeast Asia. We see different issues in the European market or the US market, where we've had a different consumer spending discussion.
Okay, how this could be achieved, particularly if in relation to problems with shipping and logistics, shipment of raw materials and final product could be affected.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that's where a lot of people are struggling today. So the reality is, as we look at the market now, let's go back. Pre-COVID, everything was focused on making the most out of shelf life of any product. So we talked about a just-in-time shipping supply chain. People didn't hold much product in country. They relied on the fact that the containers of product, whether that was raw ingredient or finished material, would turn up as it was needed into the supply chain, and so that they could push that and hold as little inventory as possible. I think one of the things companies are going to need to do is help their customers down that supply chain with their inventory and with the capital involved in it, because a lot of the companies aren't in a position today to be able to invest in building cold storage. Cold storage doesn't exist in some cases in country. So if we went to Vietnam, there is already a tight supply of cold storage, and holding products, say, in a reefer container, if we're talking frozen meat, is difficult because the reefers aren't available and everybody wants them back quickly. So we've got a storage capacity problem today that's going to be created by the fact that as demand recovers and more product starts to move, we're going to need to hold more product in country. Now, you've got some advantage within Southeast Asia in that some of that product can be moved around by road as long as the logistics are in place, and that gets you away from the sea shipping discussion, although you still got to get it by sea to Indonesia or down to the Philippines. But I think the export companies will have to take a short-term view about how they help immediately get the market restarted. And for me, it's going to be about understanding how you get a container to a market, the time delay that you're facing, and making sure that you keep a little bit of extra in that supply chain so that you can manage problems. And problems will continue to arise as we go through what we hope will be the tail end of COVID. the reality is we are not out of this, and we're going to see issues continuing to arise over the next 18 months. So we need to plan.
Okay, so what does the future hold? Do you think shipping costs will decline and producers will return to international market?
Yeah, look, I mean, we very much hope shipping costs will decline. I believe they will. I think one of the issues today is a capacity pinch globally. You know, we can talk about capacity restrictions in the US, the availability of containers, simple things like having enough lorry drivers in the European market, in the US markets, in some of the Asian markets where we've got lockdowns due to COVID. People have backed out of doing the normal work that they did. So the supply chain everywhere isn't working. Everybody is trying to work out how to build more capacity globally in shipping infrastructure. So we are going to see some new ships. We're going to see more containers being made. We're going to see terminal upgrades that will allow more containers to be moved through. The inspection systems will be streamlined. It just takes a time to put those investments in place. The container companies are making money today. They have money to reinvest. So what I think will happen is, as we see that increase in capacity begin to come online, then we'll see those container costs begin to drop back. Maybe not back to where they were, because obviously all this investment is going to need to be paid for. But I think we're going to come down considerably from the high we're on. That increase in infrastructure means that we'll see the international groups come back into the market. One of the other things we'll see is that China will need less imports of meat as they begin to sort their pork problem out. And again, at the moment they've got an oversupply, hence the low prices. They're going to have a shortfall again as they go through some volatility while they sort out this modernization. So that process is far from done. But as China backs off and that infrastructure comes in online, the international companies will come back to the Asian markets and you'll have to compete with them, which is why I said right back at the beginning, you need to think about how you develop your business relationships within the region today, because at the moment the competition isn't as it was 2-3 years ago, but it is going to become more pronounced over the next 5 years. So build relationships, build brands with the customers and the consumers, and that should stand you in a good position going forward over the next 5 and 10 years.
So until demand normalizes in the markets, it is likely that this situation will continue?
Yes, yeah, exactly that. I mean, and we talk about a normal, but no one's really sure what the new normal is. And we spend as a company a lot of time tracking global livestock and meat production, but especially within Asia, we're looking at that on a nearly a daily basis at the moment. We produce that as an annual report for people to come and look at and think about. But there are two problems. One is the demand for meat at the end of the day, which is going to be linked to people going back to work and getting some comfort that they have a consistent income over the next month, then over the next year. Then those consumers will come back to wanting an increase in meat consumption. That'll be particularly good for chicken because it's the lower income species. And then we'll see that go up the chain. So we've got an issue there. And then obviously we need to understand the competition in the international market. And that also will normalize as we come out of this COVID situation.
Do you think this situation will stabilize in the next 3 or 5 years with some new norms, Rupert?
Yeah, I think that would be our reading. I mean, COVID is still very difficult to read, but we can look around the world and understand the consumer reactions. The vaccination programs, where they're in place, are very successful in reducing deaths. And so as we begin to get a handle on how to live with COVID, I don't think we're going to get rid of it realistically. It's about living with it and managing it. Then the global markets will normalize and people will be more comfortable. So I think realistically 18 months, that process begins to start. 3 years is probably a good area where we can talk about being normalized from this. And by 5 years, we should be back into the standard, it will be just something we live with. And it will be managed like everything else. And so we'll be back into a world where we plan on and worry about other things rather than disruption from COVID. I hope.
Interesting. Anything else you want to say, Rupert?
No, look, I think there's an awful lot to talk about in the region at the moment. ASF was a huge event within the meat industry across Asia, and even if you're in a market that doesn't particularly consume or buy pork, the stress that it put on the availability of other meats, chicken and beef, and even fish, has had a marked impact. So that was the catalyst for where we stand today. The problem is it's then followed by COVID and a completely different set of drivers. This is unique. In my 20 years in the industry, we haven't seen a situation like this. The industry continues to work hard to plan for it, but you've got to look at short-term volatility in consumer demand, in your raw inputs, whether that's feed or whether that's meat, and understand that you are going to be faced with supply chain issues, labor issues, and inflation over the next 18 months, and you've got to manage that risk as you go. And I'm always happy to talk to people. It's been really nice to talk to you today, and I think this is a fascinating time in the industry. And just plan and watch and plan and take time out from the daily schedule to think about the big picture. It's particularly important today.
Okay. Thanks a lot for sharing your insight and experiences, Rupert. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Significant profits made now in shipping will be reinvested for the long term, increasing global capacity. This will allow international shippers to make the most of global markets. Thank you for listening to another Asian Agribiz podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you get your podcast from. This is Rush signing off.